They told you that the world is fixed. But what if I tell you that everything you see is nothing more than the mirror of your own consciousness? And in this opening, I will reveal the foundation of Neville Goddard's vision, where thought is not passive, but the architect of reality itself. This is how it unfolds when you realize that objects, events, and people are not independent forces, but shadows of your inner state taking on form and shape. This is where the illusion deepens, because the solidity of the external world begins to dissolve as you grasp that it is only a projection from within. This is why it matters, for once you know that consciousness is primary, you understand that you are not trapped by circumstances, but instead are their silent creator. This is the turning point when life stops being a sequence of random accidents and instead becomes a deliberate story scripted in the theater of imagination. This is how freedom announces itself, when you awaken to the truth that the world cannot be separated from what you assume and believe to be true. This is why circumstances lose power, for their seeming strength is only borrowed from the states of mind you have chosen to occupy. This is how destiny is rewritten, not by fighting conditions, but by shifting the inner stance that sustains them. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that cause lies not in action, but in the invisible field of awareness behind every action. This is the revelation that shakes old beliefs, showing that external reality is always downstream of consciousness, never the other way around. This is where perspective shifts, because you begin to see that blaming others or the world is like cursing your own reflection in a mirror. This is the moment clarity arrives, for if the reflection displeases you, the change must come not from the glass, but from the source of the image. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that all limitations are self-imposed by the states of consciousness you persist in. This is why Neville dared to declare that consciousness is the only reality, not as philosophy, but as practical law. This is how empowerment takes root, when you realize that you no longer need permission or external conditions to change your world. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you step beyond victimhood into creative authority. This is how silence becomes golden, for in stillness you recognize yourself as the dreaming power animating everything. This is why the world bends in subtle ways, because it has no choice but to echo your inner command. This is how the foundation is set, a truth so simple yet so radical that it redefines existence itself. This is where the story begins. Consciousness, the only reality, the first and last cause of all you will ever know. Can you imagine discovering that beneath every thought, every feeling, and every assumption lies something even more primal? The simple fact that you are aware, and that awareness is the bedrock upon which all else is built. This is how it unfolds when Neville Goddard insists that awareness is not a byproduct of the brain, but the eternal stage on which every drama of life plays out. This is where the illusion deepens, as you see that objects, people, and even the body itself rise and fall within the unchanging presence of awareness. This is why it matters, because once you grasp that awareness precedes all, you stop mistaking temporary forms for lasting truths. This is the turning point when you realize that no experience can exist outside of your conscious recognition of it. This is how freedom announces itself, for nothing can truly bind awareness. It watches joy and sorrow, wealth and poverty, birth and death with the same silent gaze. This is why circumstances lose power, when you anchor yourself not in fleeting conditions, but in the permanence of being aware. This is how destiny is rewritten, because when you shift identification from the transient to the eternal, your entire sense of self transforms. This is where the veil lifts as you recognize that even thoughts are visitors passing across the screen of consciousness. This is the revelation that awareness itself is untouched by what it observes, like a mirror unstained by the images it reflects. This is where perspective shifts, for you realize that your true identity is not the roles you play, but the awareness watching the roles unfold. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you see that awareness has always been present, before memory, before language, before even the sense of time. This is how the great secret hums beneath the silence, telling you that no matter what storms pass through your life, the awareness behind them remains whole and unbroken. This is why Neville's teaching cuts so deeply. because he shows that consciousness is not just creative, it is foundational, the root from which all else springs. This is how empowerment takes root when you understand that even your imagination draws its strength from this underlying presence. This is where the shift into mastery begins, because to know yourself as awareness is to step into timeless power beyond circumstance. This is how silence becomes radiant, when you rest as the observer rather than the observed. This is why the world bends in subtle ways once you stop clinging to forms and begin living from the formless. This is how the foundation of existence reveals itself, not as matter, not as energy, but as the eternal awareness that is always here. This is where the story of awakening deepens, for to stand in awareness is to stand in the origin of all creation itself. Picture for a moment the staggering possibility that the images you entertain in the secrecy of your mind are not idle fantasies, but the blueprints of tomorrow's reality, waiting only for your acceptance to burst into form. This is how it unfolds when Neville declares that imagination is the true creative power of the universe, greater than action, stronger than effort, and more real than the facts you see before you. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world teaches you to dismiss imagination as daydreaming, while Neville insists it is the root of all creation. This is why it matters, for if imagination is creative, then the limits of your imagination are the only limits you will ever know. This is the turning point when you realize that every invention, every work of art, every triumph of human spirit began as an image held in the theater of the mind. This is how freedom announces itself, because when you master imagination, you master the origin of experience itself. This is why circumstances lose power, since they are only the residue of previous imaginal activity, powerless before new assumptions. This is how destiny is rewritten, not by fighting against outer facts, but by planting new imaginal seeds that will, with certainty, grow into their likeness. This is where the veil lifts as you begin to see that imagination and reality are not two, but one continuous field of cause and effect. This is the revelation that imagination is not fiction, but the invisible reality that solidifies into the tangible world. This is where perspective shifts when you stop doubting your inner pictures and begin nurturing them as sacred previews of what must come. This is the moment clarity arrives, because you realize the imagination you once dismissed is in fact the secret workshop of creation. This is how the great secret hums in silence, whispering that to imagine deliberately is to shape the destiny of nations and the fate of individuals. This is why Neville dares to equate imagination with God, for in the act of imagining, you exercise the divine faculty of creation itself. This is how empowerment takes root, for you are no longer at the mercy of chance, but at the helm of the creative power within. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you learn to assume images with feeling and persistence until they clothe themselves in fact. This is how silence becomes generative, for in stillness you can plant imaginal acts that will bloom without resistance. This is why the world bends in response to visionaries who dared to imagine boldly and refuse the tyranny of appearances. This is how the creative power of imagination asserts itself, not as theory, but as the hidden machinery behind every visible form. This is where the story deepens, for once you embrace imagination as power, you hold the key to remaking the world in the likeness of your highest vision. Now consider this. What if the person you think you are, the successes, the failures, the name, the history, is not your true self, but only a state of consciousness you have temporarily worn like clothing? This is how it unfolds when Neville explains that life is not fixed identity but a movement through countless states, each with its own moods, behaviors, and outcomes. This is where the illusion deepens, because society convinces you that you are your role, your job, or your reputation, yet Neville insists those are only masks upon the eternal self of awareness. This is why it matters, because the moment you realize you are not bound to one state, you discover the power to shift into another deliberately. This is the turning point when depression, poverty, or limitation stop being life sentences and become only temporary stations along a greater journey. This is how freedom announces itself when you recognize that you, as the self, are never diminished or elevated by the passing states you inhabit. This is why circumstances lose power, for they are only the outpicturing of the state you presently occupy, nothing more. This is how destiny is rewritten, because by choosing a higher state and persisting in it, you move the trajectory of your life into alignment with a new destiny. This is where the veil lifts as you realize that you have walked through countless states already: childhood, adolescence, adulthood. Yet something unchanging has observed them all. This is the revelation that the self is eternal awareness, while states are fleeting garments you can put on and take off. This is where perspective shifts, for once you stop identifying with the costume, you gain the freedom to choose which role you will play next. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you see that even so-called personality traits are only habits of consciousness that can be shifted at will. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, reminding you that you are not stuck. You are simply parked in a state whose engine you can choose to start or abandon. This is why Neville urges his students to imagine boldly, for imagination is the passport between states. This is how empowerment takes root when you stop saying, "I am this way," and start declaring, "I choose this state now." This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you learn to rise above reactive states and deliberately enter those that serve your vision. This is how silence becomes transformative, because in stillness you can step out of the noise of one state and into the serenity of another. This is why the world bends when you shift states, for life has no choice but to conform to the costume of consciousness you have put on. This is how the truth of states versus self reveals itself. You are not the passing forms, but the eternal chooser behind them. This is where the story ascends, for to know yourself as awareness, navigating states is to awaken as the director of your life's play. Suppose you discover that the secret doorway to transforming your entire life is not effort, struggle, or chance, but the quiet act of assuming the feeling of your desire fulfilled until reality bends to meet it. This is how it unfolds when Neville reveals the law of assumption, the principle that what you inwardly accept as true with conviction and feeling must harden into fact. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world insists you must wait for evidence before you can believe, while Neville demands you believe first and let evidence follow. This is why it matters, because by reversing the order, believing before seeing, you unlock the creative power hidden in consciousness itself. This is the turning point when you realize that assumption is not wishful thinking, but the operating law of reality, silently shaping everything you encounter. This is how freedom announces itself, for you no longer need permission or external validation to shift your destiny. This is why circumstances lose power, because they are only reflections of past assumptions that can be dissolved by new ones. This is how destiny is rewritten, not by fighting appearances, but by persisting in the invisible assumption until it materializes. This is where the veil lifts, and you see that your assumptions about money, relationships, health, and identity are the unseen authors of your fate. This is the revelation that to assume with feeling is to plant a seed in the soil of the subconscious, where it must grow into the likeness of its nature. This is where perspective shifts, for you understand that assumption is not pretending. It is claiming your rightful inheritance in advance. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you realize the only barrier between you and fulfillment is your willingness to feel it real now. This is how the great secret hums within you, whispering that persistence in assumption is persistence in faith, and faith never fails to bring forth its fruit. This is why Neville declares that assumption, though invisible, is stronger than facts, for facts are only yesterday's assumptions clothed in time. This is how empowerment takes root, as you begin to test the law deliberately and see it answer with precision. This is where the shift into mastery begins, because you stop waiting and start living from the end, embodying your vision in consciousness. This is how silence becomes generative, for in quiet assumption lies the shaping of worlds. This is why the world bends when you dare to feel rich, loved, or free before there is proof, because reality has no choice but to match the seed you have sown. This is how the law of assumption reveals itself, not as superstition but as the hidden mechanism of creation working through every life. This is where the story deepens, for in assumption you find the key to become the conscious author of your destiny. Envision a world where the mistakes, regrets, and painful memories that seem to imprison you are not permanent scars but clay in your hands, ready to be reshaped by the power of imagination. This is how it unfolds when Neville introduces the radical practice of revision, the art of mentally rewriting past events until they yield new fruits in the present and the future. This is where the illusion deepens, for you were taught that the past is fixed and unchangeable, yet Neville declares it lives only in memory, and memory itself is subject to transformation. This is why it matters, because the stories you repeat about your past silently script the conditions of your present, and by changing the story, you change the outcome. This is the turning point when you realize that every painful encounter, every word spoken, every scene remembered, is not an eternal truth, but an imaginal picture that can be altered. This is how freedom announces itself. For if the past can be revised, you are no longer chained to guilt, trauma, or missed opportunities. This is why circumstances lose power, since even the roots they claim in your history can be severed by a new imaginal act. This is how destiny is rewritten, because a revised past plants different seeds in the subconscious, producing a different harvest in your present. This is where the veil lifts, showing that your mind is the true time machine, capable of traveling backward to edit and forward to create. This is the revelation that memory is not a recording, but a living script that bends to the authority of consciousness. This is where perspective shifts when you see that forgiveness is not only moral but practical, for in revising you release both yourself and others into freedom. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you discover that the weight of years can dissolve in a single night of intentional imaginal rewriting. This is how the great secret hums in your heart, reminding you that nothing is lost, for everything exists in the infinite imagination awaiting your reshaping. This is why Neville insists that your past is not your prison, but your workshop, where imagination refashions old patterns into new beginnings. This is how empowerment takes root when you look back at events that once defined you and choose to assign them a new meaning, a new outcome, a new ending. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you realize that by revising the past, you are in truth commanding the present and steering the future. This is how silence becomes creative, for in quiet meditation, you replay the old scene and rewrite it until it feels real. This is why the world bends, because when the subconscious accepts the revised memory, outer conditions must align with the new version of reality. This is how the practice of revision stands revealed, not as denial of truth, but as recognition that consciousness is the true author of time. This is where the story rises, showing that even the past itself cannot withstand the power of an awakened imagination. Think of the moment when Neville declares that feeling is the secret, and realize that imagination alone, without emotion, is like a seed cast upon stone, powerless to take root or bear fruit. This is how it unfolds when you understand that the subconscious does not respond to words or logic, but to the intensity of felt experience impressed upon it. This is where the illusion deepens, for people believe their affirmations fail because they repeat words, yet they never clothe those words with genuine feeling. This is why it matters, because the difference between a lifeless thought and a living creation is the emotional current that gives it power. This is the turning point when you see that feeling, the wish fulfilled, is not optional but essential, the golden key that unlocks the vault of manifestation. This is how freedom announces itself, for once you master the ability to generate feeling at will, you hold the very lever of creation in your hands. This is why circumstances lose power, since they can only mirror the predominant feeling you carry within. This is how destiny is rewritten, for by assuming the inner mood of success, love, or health, you set in motion the outer changes that must conform to it. This is where the veil lifts as you begin to sense the magnetic force of emotion shaping every encounter and outcome in your life. This is the revelation that feeling is not weak sentiment, but the strongest creative force flowing through human consciousness. This is where perspective shifts when you realize that joy, gratitude, and certainty are not effects to wait for, but causes to assume now. This is the moment clarity arrives as you grasp why Neville said, "If this assumption is persisted in until it becomes your dominant feeling, the fulfillment of your desire is inevitable. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that your inner emotional climate is the silent author of your fate. This is why Neville urged his students not just to think about their wish, but to dwell in the mood of its fulfillment until it felt natural. This is how empowerment takes root when you discover you can summon the very vibration of your desired life without waiting for proof. This is where the shift into mastery begins, for the more you practice embodying feeling, the more easily reality bends to meet it. This is how silence becomes radiant, when in stillness you generate the emotional warmth of your vision and let it sink deep into your being. This is why the world bends, because outer events are powerless before the magnetic pull of a sustained inner feeling. This is how the truth of feeling as the secret reveals itself, not as poetry, but as the operative law of creation. This is where the story ascends, showing that when you master feeling, you master the very heartbeat of reality itself. Ask yourself what happens when you stop relying on the evidence of your senses and instead dare to trust the unseen, believing in the invisible long enough for it to take shape in the visible. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that faith is not blind obedience to dogma, but the conscious acceptance of an imaginal reality before facts confirm it. This is where the illusion deepens, for the world insists that seeing is believing, yet Neville reverses the order and declares that believing is what brings about seeing. This is why it matters, because without faith, the imaginal act withers, while with faith, it is nourished into form. This is the turning point when you realize that faith is not passive hope, but active participation in unseen reality. This is how freedom announces itself, for faith allows you to detach from present limitations and dwell in the conviction of the desired state. This is why circumstances lose power, since faith ignores appearances and persists in the reality of the unseen until appearances bow to it. This is how destiny is rewritten, because every step of your future is already contained within the faith you hold today. This is where the veil lifts as you understand that the invisible world of imagination is the seedbed of all visible manifestation. This is the revelation that faith is not naive. It is the recognition that consciousness precedes matter and that unseen states are the true causes of seen effects. This is where perspective shifts when you see that doubt is simply faith in the wrong direction, an imaginal act clothed in fear rather than confidence. This is the moment clarity arrives, as you grasp why Neville called faith the cornerstone of all manifestation, the bridge between imagination and reality. This is how the great secret hums quietly within, reminding you that the unseen is as real as the seen, awaiting your steadfast trust. This is why Neville challenges his students to walk in faith, for only in faith can the invisible be granted permission to take shape. This is how empowerment takes root, because when you live by faith, you stop waiting on the world and begin commanding it through unseen conviction. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you learn to close your eyes to doubt and open your inner sight to the invisible reality already yours. This is how silence becomes fertile, for in the quiet of faith you rest knowing the seed of imagination is already growing beneath the soil of time. This is why the world bends, because persistent faith pulls the invisible into the visible with irresistible force. This is how the law of faith reveals itself, not as superstition, but as the unseen current guiding all creation. This is where the story advances, for faith in the invisible reality becomes the golden bridge carrying you from vision to fulfillment. Consider the possibility that within you lies a vast, unseen garden, fertile beyond measure, where every thought, feeling, and assumption you plant takes root and eventually bears fruit in the world you see. This is how it unfolds when Neville explains that the subconscious is not a passive recorder, but a living, obedient force that manifests whatever is impressed upon it with feeling and persistence. This is where the illusion deepens, because people mistake the subconscious for a mysterious external power, when in truth it is the loyal servant of consciousness, acting without question on your imaginal instructions. This is why it matters, for understanding the subconscious as fertile soil gives you the ability to plant seeds deliberately, rather than leave your life to chance. This is the turning point when you realize that negative moods, fears, and regrets are simply weeds you can uproot, while positive assumptions are seeds that can flourish beyond expectation. This is how freedom announces itself, as you see that your inner garden is yours alone to cultivate, and no circumstance can dictate what you choose to grow. This is why circumstances lose power, because the outer world is only a reflection of the patterns you have sown and nourished internally. This is how destiny is rewritten, for by impressing new assumptions upon the subconscious, you begin to harvest a reality aligned with your highest vision. This is where the veil lifts, showing that every limitation, every setback, and every success in your life originated as a thought seeded in the fertile soil of the mind. This is the revelation that the subconscious obeys without discrimination, amplifying whatever dominates your inner life, whether consciously or unconsciously impressed. This is where perspective shifts, for you understand that mastery is not external manipulation, but internal cultivation. This is the moment clarity arrives, as you see that persistent, vivid, feeling-filled, imaginal acts are the water and sunlight that nurture your desires into reality. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that every dream already exists in the soil, waiting for your conscious care to bring it to life. This is why Neville stresses the importance of assumption and feeling, for these are the tools by which you impress the subconscious and guide its growth. This is how empowerment takes root, because once you understand the obedience of this inner garden, you know that nothing external can override your internal cultivation. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you learn to observe, direct, and revise the seeds sown in the fertile subconscious with precision. This is how silence becomes productive, for in quiet reflection and imaginal rehearsal you nurture the unseen roots that will one day blossom into the visible. This is why the world bends, because an obedient subconscious acts as a conduit, translating inner states into outer expression without hesitation. This is how the law of the subconscious reveals itself, not as mystical, but as a practical, reliable partner in the creative process. This is where the story grows richer, for understanding the subconscious as fertile soil transforms every thought and feeling into a deliberate act of creation. Picture for a moment the quiet hour before sleep, when the world fades, the mind softens, and reality hangs suspended between wakefulness and dream, offering a secret doorway to creation few ever recognize. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that the state just before sleep is the most potent time to impress desires upon the subconscious, for resistance is low and the mind is receptive like fertile soil. This is where the illusion deepens, because people imagine sleep is merely rest, unaware that it is also the stage where imagination can shape the future. This is why it matters, for the dreams you consciously plant before drifting into slumber can germinate into real-life experiences with astonishing precision. This is the turning point when you realize that if you enter sleep feeling and assuming the wish fulfilled, the subconscious acts as an unseen agent, translating that state into the waking world. This is how freedom announces itself. For now, you can participate in creation even while the body rests, tapping into a reservoir of limitless potential. This is why circumstances lose power, because the unseen mechanisms of sleep operate independently of external limitations. This is how destiny is rewritten, for the seed of a wish planted in the liminal space between waking and dreaming grows unseen until it manifests. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that the mind's twilight state is a bridge connecting imagination directly to reality. This is the revelation that conscious creation is not confined to daytime effort, but thrives in the sacred threshold of sleep, where focus and assumption dominate. This is where perspective shifts, for you recognize that dreams are not random illusions but messages and mechanisms of the subconscious translating your inner assumptions. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you understand that nightly reflection, visualization, and feeling-filled assumption are powerful tools of manifestation. This is how the great secret hums, whispering that by consciously guiding your pre-sleep state, you can steer life's currents without struggle. This is why Neville emphasizes entering the end in imagination at bedtime, for the mind absorbs the feeling as though it were reality itself. This is how empowerment takes root, because you learn that creation is not bound by time or effort, but by consistent, deliberate inner experience. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you harness sleep as an ally, not merely a pause in consciousness. This is how silence becomes fertile, when in stillness you cultivate imaginal acts that the subconscious will translate into physical manifestation. This is why the world bends, because the habitual impressions carried into sleep command obedience from the unseen forces shaping reality. This is how the power of pre-sleep consciousness reveals itself, not as fantasy, but as a pragmatic method for conscious creation. This is where the story ascends, showing that the threshold of sleep is a crucible, where imagination, feeling, and faith fuse to forge your lived reality. Envision a world where the constant stream of thoughts you whisper to yourself is not harmless chatter, but the invisible script writing the events, circumstances, and experiences of your life with relentless fidelity. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that inner speech, the words and sentences you repeat silently, shapes the subconscious, impressing it with the reality you accept as true. This is where the illusion deepens, because most people believe their mind is a neutral observer, unaware that every internal conversation carries the authority to create or destroy their outer reality. This is why it matters, for mastering inner speech means harnessing the most intimate and powerful channel through which consciousness manifests existence. This is the turning point when you realize that habitual negative self-talk is nothing more than unseen assumptions working quietly against your desires. This is how freedom announces itself, for when you begin deliberately crafting your inner dialogue, you can replace limitation with empowerment, fear with certainty, and doubt with faith. This is why circumstances lose power, because the words you assume internally dictate the pattern that outer life reflects. This is how destiny is rewritten, as each carefully chosen phrase of imagination and feeling becomes a seed planting the landscape of your future. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that the stories you tell yourself every day are far more consequential than the events happening outside. This is the revelation that language is not merely communication. It is a conduit of creation, silently molding reality in alignment with dominant assumptions. This is where perspective shifts, for you begin to see that true mastery of life requires mastery of the invisible sentences that play continuously in your mind. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you understand that altering inner speech is not manipulation, but alignment with your highest imagined self. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, showing that even fleeting thoughts have the weight of authority when repeated persistently. This is why Neville insists that conscious, feeling-laden inner speech is the pathway to manifestation. This is how empowerment takes root, because once you take charge of inner speech, you become the unseen author of the world your senses perceive. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as deliberate statements and imagined dialogues sculpt circumstances with subtle precision. This is how silence becomes potent, for in quiet reflection you can correct, guide, and refine the narrative shaping your life. This is why the world bends, because subconscious obedience to repeated inner speech is absolute and automatic. This is how the principle of inner speech reveals itself, not as theory, but as the invisible hand behind every fact you encounter. This is where the story deepens, for controlling inner speech is the secret language by which consciousness commands its own creation. Can you imagine the staggering realization that within you lies the creative power of a God, and that every universe you perceive is a projection of your own imagining, waiting for you to awaken to your divine authorship? This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that man is not a passive creature, but an active creator, dreaming reality into existence through the infinite faculty of imagination. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world convinces you that power is external, yet Neville reveals that the true power resides in the unseen realm of consciousness. This is why it matters, for once you accept your divine creative nature, limitation loses authority and possibility expands infinitely. This is the turning point when you realize that every invention, relationship, and circumstance is only a reflection of the creative imagination that formed it. This is how freedom announces itself, for you awaken to the truth that there is no authority higher than your inner vision. This is why circumstances lose power, since outer events are merely mirrors of the inner Godhead expressing itself. This is how destiny is rewritten, because once you act from imagination as God, you cease reacting to conditions and begin shaping life according to your chosen vision. This is where the veil lifts, showing that what you call chance or luck is only the obedience of the subconscious to your imaginal decree. This is the revelation that divinity is not distant but immediate, resident in the quiet act of imagining and feeling your desired state as already real. This is where perspective shifts, for you see that morality, struggle, and limitation are constructs imposed by the unconscious, and that conscious imagination transcends them. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you understand that believing in your godlike nature is not arrogance, but recognition of a universal law. This is how the great secret hums within you, whispering that imagination is the faculty through which all creation flows, and that man is its conduit. This is why Neville insists that the imagination is sacred, for in it resides the power to birth worlds. This is how empowerment takes root, because to assume the state of the divine within is to awaken unseen forces that faithfully manifest your vision. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you learn to govern your imaginative faculties with precision and purpose. This is how silence becomes holy, for in stillness the imagination can expand unbounded, free from external interference. This is why the world bends, because reality cannot resist the alignment of a consciousness fully inhabiting its own godhood. This is how the principle of man as God in imagination reveals itself, not as myth, but as an operative truth behind every creation. This is where the story ascends, for once you realize your divine potential, every moment becomes an opportunity to dream, feel, and bring forth worlds anew. Now consider this. What if the stories you read in sacred texts are not historical accounts but intricate maps of the human mind? Each character and event representing a state of consciousness waiting to be realized within you. This is how it unfolds when Neville interprets Scripture as a psychological drama, showing that every parable, miracle, and command is a symbol of inner experience rather than outer reality. This is where the illusion deepens, because tradition encourages literal interpretation, while Neville insists that understanding the states behind the stories unlocks their transformative power. This is why it matters, for by perceiving Scripture as inner states, you can consciously assume, inhabit, and manifest the qualities described as divine, miraculous, or virtuous. This is the turning point when you see that the battles, blessings, and journeys of biblical figures are reflections of mental states you can evoke and master. This is how freedom announces itself, for spiritual truths are no longer distant ideals, but living, tangible experiences you can embody at will. This is why circumstances lose power, because the outer narrative is subordinate to the state of consciousness you accept and dwell in. This is how destiny is rewritten, as understanding these metaphors allows you to consciously navigate your own inner landscape and shape outer events accordingly. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that faith, obedience, temptation, and triumph are psychological conditions, each capable of being imagined, felt, and realized. This is the revelation that spiritual laws are mental laws, and the fulfillment of Scripture is accomplished in consciousness, not through ritual or external validation. This is where perspective shifts, for you recognize that miracles are not violations of natural law, but natural consequences of inner alignment with specific states. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you see that the symbolic imagery of Scripture is a practical manual for conscious creation. This is how the great secret hums, whispering that the divine stories were never about others. They were about mastering your own mind. This is why Neville emphasizes imagination as the operative tool. For each biblical metaphor becomes actionable when assumed within consciousness. This is how empowerment takes root, because you can choose which states to inhabit, thereby manifesting their realities in your own life. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as you realize that living Scripture is living consciousness, fully aware and directed. This is how silence becomes sacred, for in quiet reflection, you can enter the mental states the metaphors describe and watch their effects unfold externally. This is why the world bends. Because the subconscious, obeying your felt assumption, manifests the story you choose to inhabit. This is how the principle of scriptural metaphors as states of consciousness reveals itself, not as superstition but as a functional guide to the art of conscious creation. This is where the story deepens, showing that understanding Scripture psychologically transforms it from doctrine into direct lived experience. Picture for a moment the profound shift that occurs when you stop longing for the future and begin living as if your desire is already complete, fully embodied in the present moment. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches the principle of living in the end, where you mentally and emotionally inhabit the state of the wish fulfilled until it solidifies into reality. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world encourages waiting for proof before believing. Yet Neville reverses the sequence. Assume it now, and the world must follow. This is why it matters, for living in the end aligns thought, feeling, and subconscious acceptance, creating a powerful current that brings desires into manifestation. This is the turning point when you realize that imagining yourself already in possession of your goal generates the same vibrational imprint as actual attainment. This is how freedom announces itself, for no longer are you enslaved by lack, limitation, or uncertainty. You dwell in fulfillment now. This is why circumstances lose power, because outer conditions cannot resist the reality already assumed in consciousness. This is how destiny is rewritten, as the end assumed internally sets the trajectory of every external event toward completion. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that the secret is not merely wishing, but fully embodying the feeling, thought, and state of your fulfilled desire. This is the revelation that time is a construct of consciousness, and by living in the end, you operate beyond its constraints. This is where perspective shifts, for you begin to see that impatience, struggle, and doubt are signs of living in the wrong temporal orientation. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you recognize that all manifestation flows from the internal state, not the outer effort. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, showing that the world responds with precision to the reality you accept as true. This is why Neville insists on persistence in assumption, for only continuous dwelling in the end solidifies its impression on the subconscious. This is how empowerment takes root, because once you live in the end, you cease to negotiate with circumstances and begin commanding life through your chosen state. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as the act of imagining and feeling merges seamlessly with your lived experience. This is how silence becomes fertile, for in the quiet of fully assumed reality, no resistance can arise to oppose your imagined state. This is why the world bends, because the subconscious acts as a faithful executor of the internally occupied end. This is how the principle of living in the end reveals itself, not as wishful thinking, but as a precise, operative law of creation. This is where the story rises, for mastery begins when your present consciousness matches the fulfillment of your deepest desire. Can you imagine that the riches or lack you experience are not dictated by banks, jobs, or economy, but by the state of consciousness you habitually occupy? This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that wealth and poverty are first imagined, first felt, and first assumed within before they ever appear outside. This is where the illusion deepens, because society conditions you to measure reality by external evidence, while Neville insists the invisible state within always precedes the visible outcome. This is why it matters, for if you cultivate a consciousness of abundance, prosperity inevitably manifests, whereas a mindset of scarcity guarantees lack. This is the turning point when you realize that money, opportunity, and resources are reflections of internal belief, not arbitrary dispensations of fortune. This is how freedom announces itself, as you recognize that no outer system can limit a mind permanently aligned with abundance. This is why circumstances lose power, because the external world obeys the dominant state of consciousness rather than resisting it. This is how destiny is rewritten, for a persistent assumption of wealth shifts habits, decisions, and events to conform with that inner state. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that your financial reality is the mirror of your own expectations, imaginings, and feelings. This is the revelation that poverty is not a condition imposed by life, but an unconscious acceptance of limitation impressed upon the fertile soil of the subconscious. This is where perspective shifts, for you understand that acquiring wealth externally is secondary. First, the inner state of prosperity must be assumed. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you see that abundance is a feeling you embody and a consciousness you inhabit, not a distant goal to chase. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that the world's seeming scarcity cannot oppose a mind fully immersed in abundance. This is why Neville stresses visualization and feeling, for imagining wealth with emotional conviction impresses the subconscious and attracts its likeness. This is how empowerment takes root, because you learn to command prosperity by cultivating the inner reality that produces it. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as financial outcomes start bending toward the consciousness you maintain, rather than external circumstance dictating your life. This is how silence becomes productive, for in the quiet of assumption, abundance is quietly sown into your future. This is why the world bends, because the subconscious acts, without hesitation, to manifest the dominant inner state. This is how the consciousness of wealth and poverty reveals itself, not as mere advice, but as a precise law of mental causation. This is where the story ascends, for understanding and assuming abundance internally is the gateway to transforming every external measure of prosperity. Think of the moment when you realize that the facts you cling to are not absolute truths, but shadows cast by the assumptions and beliefs you hold, fleeting and malleable in the light of consciousness. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that facts are only the outer reflections of inner states, and that reality is not fixed, but obedient to the dominant imagination. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world insists that facts are immutable, yet Neville shows that what is perceived as unchangeable is merely the temporary expression of collective or personal assumptions. This is why it matters, for once you understand facts as pliable reflections, you gain the authority to change your outer world by altering the inner reality that produces them. This is the turning point when you see that statistics, histories, and apparent certainties are all subordinate to the imaginal assumptions that gave them form. This is how freedom announces itself, because nothing external can truly constrain a mind that comprehends the mutable nature of facts. This is why circumstances lose power, since they exist only as the consequences of inner acceptance, not as independent forces. This is how destiny is rewritten, for by assuming a different state of consciousness, the facts of your life will reorganize themselves to align with your vision. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that reality is not a battlefield of immutable truths, but a reflection of your inner world. This is the revelation that mastery is not about confronting facts, but about changing the consciousness that underpins them. This is where perspective shifts, for you begin to see obstacles, limitations, and evidence of failure as nothing more than temporary shadows awaiting the light of your assumption. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you recognize that persistence in the inner reality of your desire transforms outer facts with unerring precision. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, reminding you that outer conditions are never primary. They are always secondary to imagination and feeling. This is why Neville emphasizes faith in the invisible, for facts obey only the inner reality impressed upon the subconscious. This is how empowerment takes root, as you realize that you can live beyond apparent realities, dictating the world through internal conviction. This is where the shift into mastery begins, for once you operate from the source of creation rather than the shadow of facts, nothing external can resist your intent. This is how silence becomes strategic, as the quiet assumption of your desired state recalibrates the world around you. This is why the world bends, because the subconscious, faithfully reflecting your assumptions, rearranges facts to match your dominant inner state. This is how the shadow world of facts reveals itself, not as a prison, but as a responsive canvas for conscious creation. This is where the story deepens, for understanding that facts are shadows empowers you to step fully into the role of conscious author of your reality. Ask yourself what happens when you begin to observe your own thoughts, feelings, and assumptions with the detachment of a witness, noticing not only what arises but the subtle patterns that shape your life. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that self-observation is the key to conscious creation. For without awareness, the subconscious operates unchecked, perpetuating old habits and limitations. This is where the illusion deepens, because most people mistake identification with thought for identity itself, unaware that observation allows a shift from reactive living to deliberate creation. This is why it matters. For the moment you become aware of your inner states, you gain the power to alter them, guiding the subconscious to new, desired outcomes. This is the turning point when you realize that observing your feelings, moods, and mental images is not passive reflection, but an act of creation in itself. This is how freedom announces itself, for awareness allows you to step outside the tyranny of habitual thought and assume the states that serve your vision. This is why circumstances lose power, because the outer world can only enforce what you accept internally. Once you choose differently, its hold diminishes. This is how destiny is rewritten, as conscious attention to your inner life reshapes patterns that previously ran automatically. This is where the veil lifts, showing that mastery is not about controlling the world, but controlling the inner landscape from which the world arises. This is the revelation that the observer within is the true self, and by maintaining awareness, you hold the authority to direct all outcomes. This is where perspective shifts, for you begin to recognize that every event, person, and circumstance is a mirror reflecting your predominant assumptions. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you see that change begins with noticing, naming, and redirecting your inner states. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that awareness is both the lens and the lever through which creation unfolds. This is why Neville insists on vigilance, for unchecked thought patterns automatically manifest their likeness in your life. This is how empowerment takes root, as self-observation allows deliberate choice rather than unconscious repetition. This is where the shift into mastery begins, for you can interrupt habitual responses and replace them with intentional assumptions aligned with your desires. This is how silence becomes transformative, because in quiet observation, the seeds of change are planted and nourished. This is why the world bends, as outer conditions mirror the precise quality of inner attention maintained over time. This is how self-observation and awareness reveal themselves, not as abstract practice, but as the operative instrument of conscious creation. This is where the story ascends, for once you observe consciously, you become the architect of both inner and outer realities. Envision a life where every thought, feeling, and assumption is soaked in gratitude, not for what is visible, but for the invisible reality of your desire already fulfilled, radiating from within like sunlight. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that gratitude is the atmosphere in which all manifestations thrive, accelerating the translation of imagined states into tangible outcomes. This is where the illusion deepens, because people often wait for evidence before feeling grateful. Yet Neville insists that gratitude must precede and create the evidence. This is why it matters, for the feeling of thankfulness aligns the subconscious with fulfillment, magnetizing circumstances, opportunities, and people to match. This is the turning point when you realize that gratitude is not passive sentiment, but a dynamic force, reshaping perception and attracting corresponding realities. This is how freedom announces itself, for in gratitude you release attachment to lack and limitation, living instead in the certainty of abundance. This is why circumstances lose power, because the magnetic current of appreciation transcends all external resistance. This is how destiny is rewritten, as persistent gratitude impresses the subconscious with the reality of completion, directing life toward that fulfillment. This is where the veil lifts, showing that the quality of your inner atmosphere governs the shape and texture of external life. This is the revelation that gratitude is not mere courtesy to life, but a deliberate creative tool, activating laws that operate invisibly and unerringly. This is where perspective shifts, for you see that focusing on absence only reinforces absence, while gratitude seeds the reality you wish to live. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you understand that cultivating an inner climate of thanks is more powerful than striving or struggling against appearances. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that appreciation is the language of creation, silently commanding obedience from the subconscious. This is why Neville emphasizes that daily practice of gratitude transforms habitual consciousness, aligning it with desired ends. This is how empowerment takes root, because the act of feeling genuinely thankful cultivates an internal state from which manifestations inevitably emerge. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as gratitude becomes not a reaction but a chosen and persistent state. This is how silence becomes fertile, for in quiet acknowledgement of your fulfillment, unseen currents move to solidify it in reality. This is why the world bends, because a consciousness immersed in gratitude radiates a vibration that circumstances must mirror. This is how the atmosphere of gratitude reveals itself, not as philosophy, but as a practical, invisible field shaping every outcome. This is where the story ascends. For when life is lived in this atmosphere, all desires find effortless passage from imagination into manifestation. Suppose you discover that the key to bridging imagination and reality is not occasional effort or fleeting inspiration, but the relentless, unwavering persistence of assumed states over time, creating a continuous current that the subconscious cannot ignore. This is how it unfolds when Neville teaches that persistence in assumption is the practical application of the law of continuity, ensuring that the state you occupy mentally remains unbroken until manifestation occurs. This is where the illusion deepens, because the world promotes sporadic enthusiasm and intermittent effort, while Neville reveals that consistency, not intensity alone, is the invisible engine of creation. This is why it matters, for without persistence, even the most vivid imaginal acts dissolve before the subconscious can translate them into outer form. This is the turning point when you realize that each repeated assumption, each sustained feeling, and each maintained mental image strengthens the invisible thread connecting imagination to reality. This is how freedom announces itself, as you recognize that no external event can reverse the momentum of a consciousness persistently dwelling in the end. This is why circumstances lose power, because continuity in feeling and assumption overrules fleeting appearances and temporary resistance. This is how destiny is rewritten, as the unbroken current of belief gradually reshapes the conditions of life to match the imagined state. This is where the veil lifts, showing that consistency in consciousness is more potent than external struggle, effort, or negotiation. This is the revelation that persistence is not stubbornness, but the disciplined application of creative law, patiently cultivating the seed of imagination until it flowers. This is where perspective shifts, where you begin to see that time is neutral, and persistence in assumption makes apparent delays irrelevant. This is the moment clarity arrives, when you understand that maintaining the inner reality continuously ensures its external embodiment without exception. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, revealing that what appears as coincidence or luck is often the fruit of persistent inner assumption. This is why Neville stresses the importance of daily practice, repeated imaginal acts, and sustained feeling, for these form the invisible architecture of manifestation. This is how empowerment takes root, because through persistence, you claim authority over the slow-moving currents of life and guide them toward your chosen end. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as every moment of consistent assumption reinforces the reality you intend to experience. This is how silence becomes resilient, for in quiet, repeated imagining, you reinforce the pattern that will inevitably emerge outwardly. This is why the world bends, because the subconscious cannot resist a stream of consciousness unbroken by doubt or distraction. This is how persistence and the law of continuity reveal themselves, not as abstract theory, but as the practical force by which desires are inexorably realized. This is where the story reaches its penultimate ascent, showing that the quiet, persistent mind directs the unfolding of reality itself. Envision a moment when every principle Neville taught, the law of assumption, revision, feeling, faith, living in the end, and persistence, merges seamlessly into a single, coherent practice of conscious creation, where thought, feeling, and imagination act in perfect harmony. This is how it unfolds when mastery of consciousness is achieved, and life becomes the faithful mirror of the inner states you cultivate deliberately and consistently. This is where the illusion deepens, because until now, most people operate fragmented, reacting to circumstances rather than orchestrating them from the fullness of awareness. This is why it matters, for true power emerges only when all techniques are integrated into daily living, producing effortless alignment with desire. This is the turning point when you realize that mastery is not a final destination, but a continuous, conscious engagement with every thought, feeling, and assumption shaping your reality. This is how freedom announces itself, for no longer are you bound by outer conditions. The inner world is sovereign, and the outer reflects it flawlessly. This is why circumstances lose power, because the fully integrated mind impresses a singular, dominant state upon the subconscious that external life cannot resist. This is how destiny is rewritten, as the seamless orchestration of imagination, feeling, and persistence generates events and outcomes in precise accordance with intention. This is where the veil lifts, revealing that conscious creation is not mystical but practical, logical, and consistent when fully embodied. This is the revelation that mastery of consciousness is the true art of living, transforming every experience into a deliberate expression of your chosen state. This is where perspective shifts, where you now see that every obstacle, every challenge, and every opportunity is a canvas for conscious engagement rather than a barrier to be overcome. This is the moment clarity arrives, as you understand that integration is the process of living in alignment with the unseen laws governing reality. This is how the great secret hums beneath the surface, whispering that the fully awakened mind commands reality effortlessly, in every sphere of life. This is why Neville emphasizes continuous practice, for mastery requires repetition, refinement, and unwavering assumption until it becomes second nature. This is how empowerment takes root, because integrated consciousness ensures that inner states and outer results are never in conflict. This is where the shift into mastery begins, as life unfolds predictably according to the lawfully impressed assumptions of a disciplined imagination. This is how silence becomes omnipotent, for in quiet, integrated awareness, creation flows without resistance. This is why the world bends, because a mind fully harmonized with imagination, feeling, and faith exerts absolute influence over every aspect of experience. This is how the mastery of consciousness reveals itself, not as a rare gift, but as the natural consequence of deliberate practice and inner discipline. This is where the story culminates, showing that to integrate all principles is to step fully into the role of conscious architect of your life, creating reality with intention, precision, and joy.